look forward to questions.
Okay, thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Let's move on to Colin. Colin is a research fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies, agricultural economist who is very experienced on working on sub-Saharan African matters. And Colin has been working with our colleagues in the Future Agricultures Consortium in both Kenya and Malawi, looking at aspects of performance at district level of the Ministries of Agriculture. Colin.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone, for making it out on a bitterly cold night. As Steve said, I shall be reporting on some case study work done in 7 districts, 4 in Kenya, 3 in Malawi, in 2007 and 2009. In Kenya, we had fairly young Kenyan researchers going out and spending time in the districts and talking to ministry staff and various NGOs and farm representatives. So some individual interviews with farmers, some focus group stuff. In Malawi, a more senior colleague, Blessing Shinsinga, was responsible for the Malawi work. The Kenyan districts were chosen to give quite a variety in terms of the conditions that you find, because it is such a diverse country agroecologically. So you've got 2 fairly high potential areas in there, in Eldoret West in the Rift Valley, major maize surplus area, and Nyeri South, dairy, tea, coffee, horticulture, close to Nairobi. And then 2 lower potential ones, Mwingi semi-arid, which is regularly dependent on food aid and where livestock is probably more important than crop agriculture, and Ratronia right down in the west, medium agroecological potential, but really quite remote. And then note that the 2 higher potential ones also have very influential champions in them. So Nyeri South is the President's home constituency, and Eldoret West, where the Minister comes from. And a sample in Malawi, where, again, a bit of variety, and less variety in Malawi in general in terms of agroecology. A couple of districts, Rumpi and Dedza, with a certain amount of tobacco in there, and quite a contrast between Rumpi and Tiolo in terms of the relative land abundance, but again chosen partly for the politics of this, to see how the sort of political allegiances linked up with how the ministry performed and what was really determining performance of the ministry. There are the case study reports are on the Future Agriculture's website, as are some summary policy briefs, which you can see up there and you can read, and we'll tell you more than I don't have time to say tonight. Steve has talked about the context of renewed interest in agriculture. We have the Maputo Declaration to look to increase spending on agriculture within national budgets of African countries. And without prejudging any debates about how much of what the ministry does can be privatised and how much has to stay within state hands, how much can be done in conjunction with NGOs, etc., proceeding on assumptions that there still will need to be an effective ministry capacity for policy setting, mainly at national level, for coordination for service delivery, being a more local level thing, and farmers needing access to a range of services, some of which might have the right incentives to be privately provided, others of which probably won't. So how do you get the sort of service deliverers together? And then ultimately, if you're boosting your spending on agriculture, you've got to make sure that what you do spend is spent productively, whether it's on research, extension, irrigation, investment, but you need some capacity to analyse these opportunities, to plan, etc. And we haven't explored this, but I've wanted to look at this for a while. I think there's potentially a very interesting contrast between the Ministry of Agriculture on the one hand and Ministries of Health and Education on the other. And Steve mentioned that there was interest in how the Ministries of Agriculture was structured and performed 20 or 30 years ago. And then under structural adjustment, there was an assumption that quite a lot of what the ministry does actually should just get the state out and the private sector would do it. Whereas in health and education, that was more difficult to assume, and therefore you just had to tackle the capacities of the Ministries of Health and Education a bit more head-on. You couldn't just completely go round them. And so our perception is there's been a lot more effort in making sure systems work in these places. Rebecca's already talked about the fact that in Zambia there's much better connection with education and with the health systems than there is with agriculture. And anecdotally, I pick this up in all sorts of places where I go. If we talk about the Maputo Declaration, we're looking to raise agriculture share of the national budget up to 10% of the national budget. Well, in Malawi, it's over that already because of the fertilizer subsidy program. In Kenya, it's sort of nestling around 5%. But you would routinely expect to see education having 15% and health having 10%. So they're getting more resources, and I think over the last 20 years there's been a lot more effort in trying to make those ministries function better and put in the systems to use it. So I think agriculture starts quite a long way behind here. Before I get on to the effectiveness of a ministry, just one slide only on the role, and just really the sort of central point I want to make here is that as somebody who sort of thought this for a while, I was very pleasantly surprised in Kenya with our diversity of districts to hear stakeholders say effectively that what they think the ministry ought to do depends very much on the level of local market development. So if you take Nyeri South, where you've got quite well established commodity chains for the major commodities, okay, there have recently been problems in dairy, and there are still very much political problems around coffee and co-ops, but you do have fairly major commodity chains working there, largely outside of the ministry. When they work well, farmers don't need to bother with the ministry too much. Input supply systems work okay in Nyeri South, being so close to Nairobi. There's even some credit available to relatively smallholder farmers in that area, which is very rare around Africa. And you could say, well, what does the ministry need to do there? And not a huge amount in some ways. It doesn't have to be too proactive. There are extension functions, and there are some cross-cutting issues like soil fertility, which are not going to be picked up by any of the commodity chains and the sort of buyer system. So if the ministry is not trying to work on those cross-cutting issues, nobody's going to. If you go to Raichonyo, right at the edge of the country, and I think it is now rather better connected by road than when we went there, everybody, not just the ministry, said, well, who's going to facilitate links to input markets, output markets? There's no decent commodity chains here. Financial markets, nobody's offering any financial services here. If a ministry's not going to do that for the farmers, who else is? And it's not really saying the ministry is a great organisation well equipped to do this. It's more saying there's nobody else going to do it if we don't build the capacity of the ministry to do it. At the same time, there are also cross-cutting issues. I have never been to a place where there is so much striga affecting the maize. It was just amazing, and also where there's so much sediment pouring down the rivers and leading to the sort of water hyacinth blossoms in Lake Victoria. So, there are clearly cross-cutting things that need to be done and aren't being done. But there are also other things which don't need to happen in Nyeri South, which probably do in Raichonyo. And so you compare the very different views across the different districts as to what the ministry ought to be doing with what the ministry's own charters say, and they have a national charter from which each district derives its own service charter, but they're basically standard across all districts, and it's for quite a narrow extension focus, and it's not really tailored to the particularities of the local context. So in terms of ministry performance, I find it very helpful to think about what Nicholas van der Walle and others talk about Neo-Patrimonial States, where you have within the state you have a technocratic, or I think he calls it legal rational component, and you have a political component, and they're sort of in tension with each other. And this is beautifully illustrated in Kenya, where in the early years of President Kibaki's presidency, there was quite a strong technocratic push within the ministry to get increased budget. There were some high-level champions in Nairobi pushing for that. there was a reallocation of staff across districts in 2006, which actually took staff from the favoured districts of Nyeri South and Eldoret West, reallocated them to less well-resourced staff. And if that's not a technocratic change, you know, what is? And I'll come back to district agricultural officers, a sort of manager at the district level. I was very impressed by all the individuals I met there, and I want to sort of contrast that with the field staff in a later slide. So there are these technocratic elements pushing for a stronger ministry, but then it's in this, got to be careful not to be too dismissive about it, but very difficult political context. So Kenyan politics have been all about trying to build, maintain, rebuild, consolidate political alliances in a shifting pattern of alliances since Kibaki came in. And in order to accommodate more interest to build these regional coalitions, there's been absolute proliferation of ministries so that every party can have their ministry. So there were 3 ministries of agricultural rural development in 2002, and there are now 9 or 10. So the Kalenjin have kept agriculture, and the Maasai have got livestock, and we've added fisheries, and we've added all sorts of things. And trying to then coordinate that on the ground is really difficult. To some extent, it's the same staff, and they still sit in offices next to each other, and if one office has a vehicle but no driver, and the other has a driver but no vehicle, and another one has a bit of budget for fuel, they will work together on that level. But there are stories in every one of our districts about problems of imbalance of allocation across ministries. So in Mwingi, the agriculture ministry with much of a focus on crops had a far bigger budget than livestock, which was a much more important activity in the area. In Nyeri South, as part of the budgetary stimulus package in 2008-2009, 20 million shillings given for aquaculture development, but there was no fisheries officer, so the money couldn't get used. In the same district, there were no real obvious livestock diseases, but plenty of vets, whereas in Eldoret West, where livestock disease is quite a big problem for a major livestock area, there weren't enough vets. And we could go through every district and find out the problems of allocation across that. And stakeholders just wanted all of that to be consolidated back together and to sort of get the balance of resources across ministries to meet local needs. And that's basically politics is prohibiting that. And then the other thing that was going on, which is now being reined in, but at the time of the study, was there's a huge proliferation of districts where if a district was made up of 5 divisions, the president would arrive and say, I'm going to make this into 5 districts now, and every division becomes a district and every sort of administrative unit moves up. And it was just making budgeting very difficult, and also tracking where money was going for us was very difficult. So these two things really working in tension, and sort of patronage politics in many ways undermining a lot of the efforts of the technocrats to boost the capacity of the ministry. Now, these 2 graphs are the result of an awful lot of work, and they don't look very impressive as a result of it, but I tell you, trying to collect this data was quite difficult. What we have here, and I've put them on one slide to try and just so you can compare, but it might mean it's rather small. We have for both districts, we have almost all of the budget available to the district Ministry of Agriculture office. We're only talking Ministry of Agriculture here, not livestock and others. So all the money from different sources across 3 years around the time we were doing our work. And I've put it in real 2005 Kenyan shillings so we can compare. And just to get the scales, it looks as if in 2005-06, Rachonia in the top has much more money than Mwingi in the bottom, but actually the scales are different. So in 2005-06, they had roughly the same amount of money going in, and then Mwingi went up and Rachonia went down. Okay, but that's a scaling issue. So what I'd like to just point out here, first of all, And I should also say all the figures are taken from the government budget documents, so they are budget rather than actuals, and I'm not sure how much there is a discrepancy there. And the other thing is we don't have the actual salary budgets for these districts. So what we've done is we've taken how many staff, we knew what job grade they had, and we knew the range of salary for each job grade. So we've taken a sort of average pay for that job grade, and that's just to give us a ballpark figure of how salaries compares to other expenditure. So you will see there's quite, if you only rely on the government budget, which is the bottom two parts components of the pillar, the first thing to note is you will be very short of recurrent expenditure. You'll have lots of staff with almost no resources to do anything with. And that is compensated to quite a reasonable extent by the donor budgets, which are the top two things, but these districts are quite heavily dependent on donor budgets, and obviously as donor budgets come and go, as you can see, it makes a pretty big difference to the real expenditure year on year. In terms of sort of continuous planning, you know, very difficult when you're doubling your real expenditure over a couple of years and then it will contract again. I would also point out the one which is actually the, it's a sort of purple one near the top, cotton development. This was a I think there was some politics behind saying we must put some money into cotton industry, and really there was no planning capacity to know what to do with it, and I would say nothing has come of that money. It's just been wasted. And in terms of the sort of benefits of a strong ministry, if you're going to try and pump more money through, this is a great case. The money was put there and really nothing much has happened on that. Okay, but I would highlight, particularly in the absence of donor funding, the imbalance between salary and recurrent expenditure from the government. So we have our first imbalances across ministries within a district when actually, you know, they should be tailored to local needs. Then we have across staffing and recurrent. And then the third big inefficiency that we noticed was within the personnel. So now we had a large number of office-based people supposedly supporting a tiny number of field staff, and actually many of the field staff, the posts were vacant. And so what has happened, this is a consequence of a sort of 20-year hiring freeze, plus efforts to build to train existing staff so they're better trained academically, but then a sort of rather mechanistic link between your qualification and your position. So if you'd got a diploma or a degree, you didn't think you should be a frontline worker. So as people gradually retired over the 20-year period, the people who got a new qualification moved up and nobody was replaced at the frontline level. And that would be okay if you had decent resources for motorbikes and fuel and other things. In other words, if that balance between the staffing and the recurrent expenditure was all right, it wouldn't really matter if they weren't technically frontline extension workers, as long as they were resourced to get out in the field all the time. But they put the two together and there was not much contact in the field, and a large number of people sitting in an office. And we did some calculations which I haven't reproduced here, but if you actually just reallocated the resources that were available in these districts so that much more was put at the front line, which is where the farmers would like it to be, actually we didn't think they were that short of money for meeting quite a lot of farmers, you know, a good proportion of the farmers in the district several times a year. It's just that put the three inefficiencies together and it wasn't really happening. In Malawi, you have much less of a proliferation of ministries, but you do have actually a bigger imbalance in staff across districts. And I'm not sure exactly the history of that, but it was very uneven. There had been some increase in resources over the similar period as we were looking at in Kenya. So in this case, from President Mutharika coming in. But staff absolutely preoccupied with the administration of the fertiliser subsidy, in particular at sort of critical planting time when farmers need advice. So actually not a lot of additional contact time for farmers as a result of the additional resources. And it seems, although I haven't got comparative figures here, I wish I had, that lower wages in Malawi were encouraging more staff to spend more time away from their official duties and or just waiting for work on NGO projects where they got per diems. There had been various attempts to reform, more or less fundamental reform, in these places, and I think I'm reflecting Kenya a little bit more than Malawi here, but I'll talk about both. When we sat down with older farmers and got them to think back over as long a period as they could over the performance of the ministry over time, over a number of decades, their views were very much influenced by national policies, which included whether certain crops were getting subsidy support, or whether there was a well-functioning parastatal organisation which was well-resourced, which was supporting the development of a particular area. There were a few things which were, if new seed varieties for their main crops had come out, they appreciated those. And then very much what was in their minds was how accessible extension staff were over the period, which was primarily a resourcing issue, although obviously T&V made a big push to try and get extension staff out for a while. And when they were assessing more recent initiatives, so-called demand-led extension, or a focal area approach where the ministry concentrates its resources in one location within the district for a year or two to try and get a sort of big push and then moves on, farmers were really judging that on, well, are we seeing staff more or less? And often it was less. And the demand-led was widely seen just as an excuse for, now the ministry is saying they can't even get out to us, we've got to go to them. And it was just seen as a sort of admission that the ministry wasn't really doing its job properly, rather than appreciating what was behind it. Now, fundamental change in performance, I should say about fundamental change. First of all, just step back on the context. Both of these countries had put some additional resources into agriculture over the previous 5 years. And actually they had introduced certain innovations to try and raise performance a bit. So there is a performance contract system for all ministry staff. It cascades down. So the lower levels are trying to assist the higher level guys in achieving their objectives, a sort of cascade of performance targets. And talking to staff, that did seem to have made a difference to how they were working. It did seem to be a positive thing. In Malawi, President Mutharika became the Minister of Agriculture, so showing there was quite a lot of priority to agriculture there, and he was apparently very demanding on his senior staff in the ministry, constantly asking them to report to him and tell him about performance. So in both cases, a sort of top-down approach to try and raise performance, combined with some additional resources. So they were doing something. But the observation in both countries was that this was very much a sort of first-term thing of the president coming in, wanting to make an impact. One of the ways to try and make a positive impression is to show that you're doing something about the ministry, because it's supposed to have quite wide reach. So, yeah, pump in a bit of extra money, try in the short term to raise these performance targets, but then it sort of dies down in the second term because the president doesn't need to seek re-election again. And in terms of the, will you get fundamental change? Then you really have to question, is the political will for the fundamental change there? And things we noticed, one is coming back to the district managers who were quite key. I was very impressed by the district agriculture officer in every district we went to. Very bright, good understanding of what was going on in their district, very able to talk about it, not defensive, willing to show us the data they had. But they had no authority to sort of reward hard work from their staff, and they had a team of really demoralised people beneath them, people who maybe have been 20 years in the same grade, and because they hadn't been lucky to be upgraded from a diploma to a degree or a certificate to a diploma, hadn't had any advancement, and their performance, good or bad, didn't count at all to whether they were promoted or not. And the DAOs, it was interesting. First of all, they were degree holders, and you could be a senior subject matter specialist or a DAO above it with a degree. And only the best senior subject matter specialists could become a DAO. So they had to be quite motivated to get to DAO. And being a DAO, if you performed well, there was a chance of landing a job in Nairobi. So they had all the right performance incentives to work hard. The guys below them had all the wrong ones. And the basic problem there is that promotions and hiring and firing are handled centrally by the Civil Service Commission, and it's therefore done more on qualification. The report of the local manager really counts for almost nothing. And until you change that, which is actually even beyond the Ministry of Agriculture, it's hard to see how you're going to build in performance incentives for the guys who are currently rather demoralised. One thing that could do that is decentralisation, if you actually transfer hiring and firing to a local level. Now in Malawi, they basically have a stalled decentralisation programme, and it doesn't look like it's going to go forward. If anything, it's going to go backwards. So that doesn't really seem to be a way forward in Malawi. But in Kenya, the new constitution is claiming to make quite a big decentralisation push. And there are stakeholder fora in each district which have been developed by the ministry with a bit of donor pushing over a number of years. And up to now, they've very much been, I won't say talking shops. What happens is you have the NGOs, you have the ministry, you have some farmers groups. They come together. Unfortunately, they've already set their plans and their budgets before they come together. And if there's a bit of overlap, then they work together, and it works quite well. So field days seem to be a big success, and they all do it together. But most of their stuff is planned separately. It doesn't plan together, and nobody knows each other's budget. So the ministry doesn't know what the NGOs are spending in their district. The NGOs don't know what the ministry is spending. And so you really just have this little bit of overlap. If you actually have a decentralised process where the stakeholders actually start to shape it as part of decentralisation, then I think in Kenya it's likely to raise efficiency of the ministry, because it could bring the budgets of the different ministries into one pot. It could have greater accountability. You could change balance between staff versus motorbikes and fuel and other things. What it's unlikely to do is do anything for equity, because there are some quite well organised and vocal farmers, and you can be fairly sure they'll capture the benefits. So overall there'll be more to go round, but the capture will be by the better organised. Would be our basic impression. Thanks, Steve.